The moment I stumbled upon the messages, it felt like the ground beneath my feet had crumbled away. I had been borrowing Jack's laptop that morning, as mine was undergoing some repairs. He had left it on the kitchen counter, still logged into his work email. Normally, I wouldn't dare invade his privacy, but a new notification popped up with her name bolded in the subject line. Madeline Carter. Madeline. I knew her. Well, I knew of her, a marketing strategist from another department. Jack had mentioned her a few weeks ago, almost casually. We've started collaborating on the new campaign, he'd said over dinner one evening. She's sharp. Has some really innovative ideas. At the time I'd smiled, relieved that he seemed passionate about work again. He'd been in a slump for months, and this new project seemed to have reignited his enthusiasm. I never suspected that spark would catch fire elsewhere. The message wasn't work-related, at least not entirely. Her reply to him was simple and teasing. Don't let HR catch us flirting like this, Jack. You're too much fun to get fired over winking face. Flirting. My pulse quickened and my fingers trembled as I scrolled up to see the thread. What had started as professional exchanges about deadlines and deliverables had, over time, shifted into something else. Something softer. Something dangerous. There were inside jokes, compliments woven into banter, and then his words. You're impossible to ignore, Madeline. Beautiful and brilliant? You're setting the bar unfairly high for everyone else. My stomach twisted, nausea rising in waves as I read further. Careful, Jack, she'd replied, her tone playful but coy. Flattery like that will make me think you've got a crush. What crushed me most wasn't the content itself, it was his tone. It was the effort. Jack wasn't just being polite, wasn't just trying to maintain a good working relationship. He was chasing her. It was all there between the lines. When he came home that evening, I was waiting in the living room. The laptop sat closed on the coffee table, its presence as heavy as the air between us. Jack walked in, his tie loosened, his briefcase in hand, and froze when he saw my face. He must have known. I used your laptop, I began, my voice breaking. I saw everything. He didn't try to deny it. Instead, he sighed, setting his briefcase down and running a hand through his hair. It's not what you think, he said, his voice careful, rehearsed. I laughed bitterly, a sound that barely resembled me. Oh, really? Because it looks like you're halfway in love with her. It's not love, Emily, he snapped, his frustration bubbling over. It's harmless. Just banter. Harmless. My voice rose, incredulous. You told her she was beautiful. You flirted with her. Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring his face as I stood and faced him. Do you even hear yourself? You're married, Jack. To me. He flinched, guilt shadowing his expression. For a moment he looked like he might cry too. But instead he reached for me, his hands outstretched like he could fix it all with a touch. Emily, I didn't mean anything by it. I swear to you it's just, She's what? I demanded, stepping out of his reach. She's just too beautiful to ignore, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Em. Stupid. She's just been nice to me, you know? Complimenting my ideas, making me feel important. I didn't realize how much I needed that until she. Stop. I held up a hand, silencing him. You don't get to use that as an excuse. If you needed to feel important, you could have come to me. I'm your wife, Jack. I've been here the whole damn time waiting for you to notice me, to tell me I'm beautiful, to tell me I'm brilliant. But no. You saved that for her. He didn't say anything, and his silence spoke volumes. That night, he slept in the guest room. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every moment of our marriage like a cruel highlight reel. The way he used to look at me, the nights we spent dreaming about our future, the times we'd laughed until our stomachs hurt. When had it all changed? When had I become so invisible to him? In the days that followed, Jack made an effort. He apologized, profusely, tearfully. He swore he'd cut off all personal communication with Madeline, promised he'd focus on rebuilding what we had. And for a while I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this was just a blip, a momentary lapse in judgment. But the trust was gone. Every time his phone buzzed, I wondered if it was her. Every time he stayed late at work, I questioned if he was really at the office. The paranoia consumed me, eating away at what little love I had left for him. I started noticing other things too. The way he hesitated when I asked about his day. The way his smiles never quite reached his eyes anymore. He was trying, but something between us had broken, something neither of us knew how to fix. Weeks turned into months, and though the messages had stopped, the ghost of them lingered. I could see it in the way he avoided my gaze, in the way I flinched when he touched me. We were two strangers sharing a home, dancing around the wreckage of what we once had. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, Jack walked in and leaned against the counter. "Emily," he began, his voice heavy with hesitation. "I think we need to talk." I didn't turn to face him. I just nodded, letting the soapy water drip from my hands as I braced myself for what I knew was coming. And when he finally said the words I'd been dreading but also expecting, I felt a strange sense of relief. "I don't think we can do this anymore." He was right. We couldn't. The relief I'd felt in that moment was fleeting, quickly replaced by a hollow ache that seemed to swallow me whole. Jack's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for a long time neither of us spoke. I could hear the faint hum of the dishwasher, the muffled sound of traffic outside, and the quiet thud of my own heart. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands slowly, methodically, as if clinging to the mundane task would somehow delay the inevitable. When I finally turned to face him, he looked as lost as I felt. His shoulders were slumped, his tie loose, and his eyes, those same eyes that used to light up at the sight of me, were downcast, full of something that might have been regret, or maybe guilt, or maybe just exhaustion. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Jack rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit I'd seen 1,000 times before. "I don't know," he admitted. I don't think we can keep pretending everything's fine. It's not fair to you, and it's not fair to me." "Fair?" I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. "Was it fair when you decided to pour your energy into her instead of us? When you let her become the center of your attention while I was here, waiting for scraps?" My voice cracked, and I hated myself for the way the tears came so easily, for the way I still cared enough to hurt. "I know I screwed up," he said, his voice tight. "I know I hurt you, and I've been trying to make it right, but it's like we're stuck, Em. We're stuck in this place where neither of us is happy, and I don't know how to get us out." "Maybe you don't want to," I said flatly. "Maybe you've already decided you'd rather be with her." "That's not it," he said quickly, almost too quickly. "This isn't about her. It's about us. Or what's left of us." He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want to hurt you anymore, Emily. But I think I already have." The finality in his tone sent a chill through me. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down into an abyss, and Jack was the one holding the rope that tethered me to safety. Only now he was letting go. "I gave you everything," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of my pain. "I gave you all of me, Jack. And it still wasn't enough." He didn't respond. What could he say? That I was wrong? That it was enough? If that were true, we wouldn't be here, unraveling the life we'd built together one thread at a time. The days that followed were surreal, a blur of packing boxes and whispered conversations about logistics. We decided to separate. "For now," Jack had said, as if leaving room for some distant reconciliation. But deep down I knew. We both knew. This wasn't temporary. This was the beginning of the end. He moved into a small apartment across town, leaving behind the house that had once been filled with laughter and love. I stayed, but the emptiness was unbearable. Everywhere I looked, I saw remnants of our life together. The coffee mugs we bought on our honeymoon, the framed photos of vacations and holidays, the couch where we used to sit and talk about our dreams. It all felt tainted now, like a cruel reminder of what I'd lost. I tried to keep busy, throwing myself into work and leaning on friends who offered their support. But even with their reassurances and well-meaning advice, the loneliness was overwhelming. Nights were the worst. I'd lie awake in our bed, my bed now, staring at the ceiling and replaying everything over and over in my mind. What could I have done differently? Was there a moment I missed? A turning point where things could have been saved? And then there was Madeline. Even though Jack insisted their relationship had never crossed a physical line, the thought of her haunted me. I couldn't help but imagine her in his life, taking my place in ways both big and small. Was she making him laugh the way I used to? Was she telling him he was brilliant and handsome and all the things I used to say before he stopped listening? I hated her. But more than that, I hated him for letting her in. For choosing her, even in the smallest of ways, over the life we'd built together. Months passed, and the initial sting of betrayal began to dull, replaced by a quiet resignation. I started going to therapy, hoping to untangle the mess of emotions that still lingered. My therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Harper, encouraged me to focus on myself, to rediscover who I was outside of my marriage. It wasn't easy. For so long I'd defined myself as Jack's wife, as part of a team. Now I was just Emily, and I wasn't sure who that was anymore. But little by little, I began to piece myself back together. I took up painting again, something I hadn't done in years. I started running in the mornings, finding solace in the steady rhythm of my footsteps. I even joined a book club, where I met a group of women who reminded me what it felt like to laugh without reservation. Jack and I spoke occasionally, usually about practical matters like bills or dividing up our belongings. Each conversation was polite but distant, a far cry from the intimacy we once shared. He seemed to be doing well, or at least better than I was. Part of me wondered if he regretted anything at all, if he missed me the way I sometimes missed him. And then one day I saw him. I was walking through the park, enjoying the crisp autumn air, when I spotted him sitting on a bench. He wasn't alone. Madeline was with him, her head tilted as she laughed at something he'd said. They looked comfortable together, like two people who had found something they'd been searching for. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest as I watched them. He looked happy, happier than I'd seen him in a long time. And as much as it hurt to admit, I realized something in that moment. Maybe this was how it was meant to be. Maybe Jack and I were never going to find our way back to each other. Maybe his chapter in my life was over. It wasn't the ending I'd wanted, but it was the one I got. And slowly, painfully, I began to accept it. Because life goes on, even when your heart feels like it's been shattered into a million pieces. And someday, maybe not today or tomorrow, but someday I knew I would be okay. The sight of Jack with Madeline that day stayed with me longer than I cared to admit. Even after I walked away, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the park bench where they sat, my mind replayed the scene over and over like a cruel, unending loop. Her laugh, his easy posture, the way his hand rested on the bench just a little too close to hers. It all felt like a confirmation of everything I'd feared. I spent the rest of the day pacing around the house, my emotions swinging wildly between anger, sadness, and something resembling resignation. Part of me wanted to call him, to confront him, to demand answers to questions I already knew would never satisfy me. But I didn't. I knew better. I knew that hearing his voice, hearing whatever half-hearted justification or denial he might offer, would only dig the knife in deeper. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine, no two, and let the weight of it all crash down on me. I cried until I couldn't anymore, until my chest ached and my throat was raw. And then finally, when the tears were spent, I sat there in the quiet stillness of the evening and tried to imagine what moving forward might look like. The next few weeks were harder than I expected. Seeing Jack and Madeline together had reopened wounds I thought were beginning to heal, leaving me raw and vulnerable in ways I hadn't been prepared for. Every little thing reminded me of him. His favorite coffee mug in the cupboard, the faint trace of his cologne on a jacket he'd left behind, the way the autumn leaves piled up in our yard like they always did. Only now there was no one to rake them with me. But I kept going. I had to. Work became my sanctuary, a place where I could lose myself in deadlines and projects and the comforting hum of routine. My colleagues, though unaware of the full extent of my struggles, were kind and supportive in small, meaningful ways. A compliment on my presentation, an invitation to lunch, a simple, "How are you doing?" These gestures, though seemingly insignificant, became lifelines that helped pull me out of the darkness. It was during one of those long, exhausting days at work that I met someone new. His name was Ben, and he was a freelance graphic designer we'd hired for a major project. From the moment we were introduced, there was an ease to our interactions that felt refreshingly uncomplicated. He was funny in a quiet, self-deprecating way, with a sharp wit that kept me on my toes. But more than that, he was kind, genuinely kind in a way that felt rare and unexpected. First, I kept my distance. The idea of letting someone new into my life, of opening myself up to the possibility of more pain, felt impossible. But Ben had a way of breaking down my walls without even trying. He'd stop by my desk to share a silly meme or bring me coffee just the way I liked it, always with a soft smile that seemed to say, "I see you." I found myself looking forward to our conversations, to the moments of lightness he brought into my otherwise heavy days. And slowly, almost without realizing it, I began to let him in. One evening after a particularly late night at the office, we ended up sharing an elevator ride down to the parking garage. I was exhausted, my mind still spinning with the day's to-do list, when Ben turned to me and said, "You know, you're a lot stronger than you think." I blinked, caught off guard. "What makes you say that?" He shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know. I can just tell. You carry yourself like someone who's been through a lot, but hasn't let it break them." His words stayed with me long after I drove home that night. He didn't know the details of my life, didn't know about Jack or Madeline or the shattered pieces of my marriage. But somehow he saw me, the real me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. Over the next few months, Ben and I grew closer. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, nothing dramatic or sweeping like in the movies. It was slow and steady, built on a foundation of friendship and trust. He never pushed, never rushed me. Instead, he gave me the space I needed to heal, while quietly showing me that it was okay to hope for something better. But even as things with Ben blossomed, I couldn't fully shake the shadow of my past. Jack still lingered in the corners of my mind, a ghost I couldn't quite banish. We saw each other occasionally, at mutual friends' gatherings, or during the rare times we needed to finalize some loose end from our separation. Each encounter was a reminder of what we'd lost, and though the pain was no longer as sharp, it was still there, a dull ache that refused to fade completely. One afternoon, I ran into him at the grocery store. It was a chance meeting, unplanned and awkward. He was standing in the produce aisle, inspecting a bag of apples when he looked up and saw me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled, a small tentative smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Emily," he said, his voice warm but cautious. "Hi." "Hi," I replied, my own voice equally guarded. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, talking about work and the weather and other safe, inconsequential topics. But beneath the surface, there was a tension neither of us could ignore. "How have you been?" he asked eventually, his tone soft. I hesitated, unsure how honest I wanted to be. "Better," I said finally. "It's been hard, but I'm getting there." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm glad. You deserve to be happy, Am." For the first time in a long time, I believed him. As I walked away that day, something shifted inside me. Seeing Jack didn't hurt the way it used to. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't pleasant, but it didn't break me. And that realization that I could face him and still stand tall felt like a victory in its own small way. Life continued as it always does. I and Ben found a rhythm together, one that felt natural and comforting in a way I hadn't thought possible. He wasn't perfect and neither was I, but we didn't need to be. What mattered was that we were trying together one step at a time. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, I began to see a future that didn't revolve around the pain of my past. It wasn't always easy, and there were still moments when the old wounds ached. But for the first time in a long time I felt hopeful. Because sometimes, life doesn't give you the ending you wanted. But if you're lucky, it gives you a chance to start over. And that, I realized, was more than enough. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges of pain. As the months passed, the weight of what had happened began to feel less like a crushing burden and more like a dull ache, a constant but manageable presence. My life, though far from perfect, started to feel like my own again. There were moments of joy, small and fleeting at first, but they grew. A sunny afternoon spent walking through a farmer's market, the scent of fresh bread and flowers in the air. A rainy evening curled up on the couch with a book, the sound of droplets pattering against the windows. And then there was Ben. He wasn't a savior. He never pretended to be. What he was, though, was steady. A quiet, unassuming presence who reminded me, in the gentlest of ways, that it was okay to trust again. He never pried into the details of my past, though I knew he understood that I carried more baggage than I let on. He simply let me be, allowing our relationship to unfold at a pace that felt natural, unforced. I found comfort in his simplicity, In the way he showed up when he said he would, in the way he listened when I spoke, in the way he made me laugh with his dry sense of humor. One evening, as we sat on the porch of my house, still my house though it didn't feel as lonely as it once had, he asked me a question I hadn't expected. "Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive him?" he said, his voice gentle, careful not to intrude on wounds that might still be tender. For a moment I didn't respond. I stared out at the yard, at the fading light of the sunset casting long shadows across the grass. It was a question I'd asked myself many times, though I wasn't sure I'd ever found an answer. "I don't know," I admitted finally, turning to meet his gaze. "I think maybe I already have, in some ways. Not for him necessarily, but for me. Carrying that anger around, it's exhausting. And I don't want it to define me anymore." Ben nodded, as if he understood. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," he said. "It just means letting go." "Maybe," I said softly. "Or maybe it just means accepting that what's done is done. That nothing I do will ever change what happened." "And is that enough?" he asked. I thought about it for a long moment. "I think it has to be." The days continued to roll by, each one bringing with it a mix of challenges and quiet victories. I found myself reconnecting with parts of me I'd forgotten in the chaos of my marriage and its aftermath. I started painting again. Not the stiff, technical pieces I used to force myself to create, but wild, expressive swirls of color that felt like catharsis on a canvas. I started taking yoga classes on Saturday mornings, reveling in the way the practice forced me to slow down, to focus on my breath, to be present in my own body. I even began hosting small gatherings at my house, just a few close friends, some wine, and the kind of laughter that felt like sunlight breaking through the clouds. But as much as I was moving forward, there were still moments that caught me off guard. A song on the radio that reminded me of Jack. A casual mention of his name in a conversation with a mutual friend. A dream where he appeared uninvited, his face a strange mix of familiarity and distance. These moments didn't devastate me the way they once did, but they left me unsettled. A reminder that healing isn't always linear. One such moment came on an ordinary Tuesday. I was at work, sorting through a pile of paperwork, when my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Jack. My heart skipped a beat, the way it always did when his name appeared, though I told myself it was nothing. Probably something practical. Some leftover detail about the house or a misplaced piece of mail. But when I opened the message, it wasn't what I expected. "Hi, Emily. I've been thinking about writing this for a while now, but I wasn't sure if I should. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, and I don't blame you for that. But there's something I need to say. I'm sorry. I know I've said it before, but I don't think I ever really understood what it meant. I don't think I fully grasped how much I hurt you, how much I broke your trust. I've spent a lot of time thinking about us, about what went wrong and what I could have done differently. And the truth is, I don't have all the answers. But I know this. You didn't deserve what I did to you. You gave me everything, Emily, and I took it for granted. I let my own insecurities, my own weaknesses drive a wedge between us, and I'm so sorry for that. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I don't expect anything from you at all. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what I lost, and I'll carry that regret with me for the rest of my life. I hope you're doing okay. I hope you've found some kind of peace, some kind of happiness. You deserve that. You always did. Take care, Jack." I read the email twice, then a third time, unsure of how to feel. Part of me wanted to delete it, to erase his words the way I wished I could erase the pain he'd caused. But another part of me, the part that had spent so long carrying the weight of what happened, felt something different. Not closure exactly, but something close to it. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. His apology, while years too late, was for him as much as it was for me. And that was okay. Because in that moment I realized something important. I didn't need Jack's regret to validate my pain, and I didn't need his apology to move on. I was already doing that. One step, one day, one brushstroke at a time. And as I closed my laptop and turned back to the stack of papers on my desk, I felt a strange, quiet sense of relief. Not because everything was fixed, because it wasn't and it never would be, but because for the first time in a long time I knew I would be okay. The email lingered in my thoughts for days after I received it, not as a fresh wound but as a faint ache, a reminder of everything that had come before. Jack's words stirred something in me, but not in the way I expected. They didn't reignite old feelings or tempt me to revisit a door I'd long since closed. Instead, they confirmed what I already knew. The chapter with Jack was over. Whatever lessons I had needed to learn from that part of my life, I had learned them. And while his apology didn't erase the hurt, it gave me something I hadn't realized I needed: validation. An acknowledgement that I hadn't imagined at all, that the pain I'd carried wasn't something I had conjured out of thin air, that it mattered. But as much as his email reminded me of the past, it also served as a sharp contrast to where I was now. Life with Ben, while quieter and less dramatic, felt solid in a way I hadn't experienced before. He wasn't the kind of man to sweep me off my feet or make grand gestures, but he didn't need to be. He was steady, dependable, and endlessly kind. With him there were no highs and lows, no games or uncertainties. Just an honest, growing connection that made me feel safe for the first time in years. One evening, as we sat together in my living room, a glass of wine in each of our hands, I found myself telling Ben about the email. I hadn't planned to. Jack's name rarely came up in our conversations, but it spilled out of me anyway, unfiltered and raw. I told him about the message, about what Jack had said and how it had made me feel. And when I was finished, Ben simply nodded, his gaze steady on mine. "How do you feel about it?" he asked gently, his tone free of judgment. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me feels lighter, like I can finally let it go. But another part of me wonders why it took him so long to say it. Why now? Why not when it might have made a difference?" Ben leaned forward, setting his glass on the coffee table. "Maybe he wasn't ready before," he said. "Or maybe he didn't know how. People aren't always good at facing their own mistakes." "I guess," I said, swirling the wine in my glass. "But it doesn't really matter, does it? It's too late." "It is," Ben agreed. "But that doesn't mean it's meaningless. Sometimes apologies are more for the person giving them than the person receiving them. The important thing is what you do with it. Whether you let it hold you back, or let it help you move forward." I stared at him, struck by the simplicity of his words. He had a way of cutting through the noise, of getting to the heart of things without overcomplicating them. It was one of the many things I admired about him. And in that moment I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for him, for his presence in my life, for the quiet strength he brought to every moment we shared. "I think I'm ready to move forward," I said softly, more to myself than to him. Ben smiled, reaching for my hand. "Then let's do that. Together." Together. The word felt heavy with promise, and as his fingers laced with mine, I realized just how much that promise meant to me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was excited about the future, not as an abstract concept but as something real and tangible. Something we were building together, piece by piece. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of small but meaningful moments. Ben and I began spending more time together, not just as a couple but as two people truly integrating their lives. He helped me repaint the guest room, transforming it into a bright, inviting space. I introduced him to my friends, who immediately took to his easy charm and dry wit. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, my house, the house that had once felt so empty, began to feel like a home again. But even as my life with Ben grew stronger, I couldn't help but think about the version of myself that had once believed in a future with Jack. That version of me had been so certain, so sure of what her life would look like. And though that certainty had been shattered, it hadn't destroyed me. It had reshaped me, forced me to confront parts of myself I'd been too afraid to face. I wasn't the same person I'd been back then, and for the first time I was okay with that. I didn't want to be her anymore. One evening, as Ben and I sat in the kitchen eating takeout straight from the containers, he asked me something that caught me off guard. "Do you ever think about what you want long-term?" he said, his tone casual but curious. I paused, my chopsticks hovering over a carton of lo mein. "What do you mean?" "I mean, us," he said, setting down his fork. "Do you see this going somewhere? Or are you just taking it day by day?" The question was so honest, so vulnerable, that it took me a moment to respond. "I think," I said carefully, "that I've spent so much time looking backward, at what I lost, at what went wrong, that I haven't really let myself think about the future. But with you, I do. I see something. I don't know exactly what it looks like yet, but I know it's good." Ben's face softened, and he reached across the table to take my hand. "That's enough for me," he said simply. And it was. For both of us. The months turned into a year, and that year into another. Life wasn't perfect because it never is, but it was good. I continued to grow, to heal, to rediscover the parts of myself I thought I'd lost. And through it all, Ben was there. A steady presence who reminded me that love didn't have to be complicated to be real. One day, as we stood in the kitchen making breakfast, he turned to me with a small, nervous smile. "I have something to ask you," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "What is it?" I asked, setting down the spatula. He hesitated for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. My heart stopped, and for a moment the world seemed to fall away. "Emily," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring. "I know your past has shaped you, and I know it's been a long road to get here. But I want to be your future. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in my eyes, and I nodded, unable to find the words. Because yes. The answer was yes. To him, to us, to the life we were building together. Yes to all of it. And as I slid the ring onto my finger, I realized something that I hadn't been able to see before. The pain of my past, the heartbreak and the betrayal, it hadn't destroyed me. It had led me here, to this moment, to this man, to this life. It had shaped me, but it didn't define me. And for that I was grateful. Because in the end, it wasn't the ending that mattered. It was the new beginning. The days following Ben's proposal felt like something out of a dream. Not the overwhelming, too perfect kind, but the quiet, steady sort of dream that fills you with warmth and calm. We didn't rush into planning anything immediately. That wasn't us. Instead, we spent the first few weeks simply basking in the joy of the decision we'd made together. I caught myself absent-mindedly touching the ring throughout the day, marveling at its weight and meaning. It wasn't flashy or overly ornate, but it felt right, like it belonged. Just like Ben did. My friends, of course, were thrilled. "Finally," my best friend Grace exclaimed when I told her over coffee. I was beginning to think he'd never pop the question. She leaned back in her chair with a satisfied grin, her excitement infectious. "So when's the wedding? Spring? Fall? Are we thinking rustic chic or modern elegance?" I laughed, shaking my head. "We haven't gotten that far yet. We're just enjoying the moment." Grace rolled her eyes playfully. "Enjoying the moment is great and all, but don't wait too long. People need time to shop for dresses, you know." Ben and I eventually started to discuss the details, though in our usual unhurried way. We decided on a small ceremony, something intimate and personal, surrounded only by the people who truly mattered. The idea of a grand affair, with hundreds of guests and elaborate decorations, didn't appeal to either of us. What we wanted was something simple, something that felt like us. As the months passed and the planning took shape, I found myself reflecting more and more on the journey that had brought me to this point. It wasn't something I dwelled on intentionally, but every so often, a memory of Jack would surface unbidden. Not in the way it used to, not with pain or longing, but with a strange sort of detachment, like I was watching someone else's story unfold. I thought about the girl I had been back then, the one who had believed so wholeheartedly in a future with him, who had been shattered when that future fell apart. She felt like a stranger now, someone I barely recognized. And yet, I felt an odd sense of gratitude for her resilience, for her ability to pick up the pieces and keep moving forward. About 2 months before the wedding, I received another email from Jack. This one was shorter than the last, more formal, but it still caught me off guard. He'd heard about the engagement, though I wasn't sure how, perhaps through mutual friends or social media. The message was polite, almost distant, and he wished me well, congratulating me on what he called a fresh start. There was no apology this time, no attempt to reopen old wounds, just a simple acknowledgement of where our lives had taken us. I didn't respond. There was no need to. His words felt like a closing note on a chapter one had already finished. And as I read them, I realized that I no longer felt the pull of those memories, the weight of what had been. They were there, yes, but they no longer defined me. I had moved on. I was happy. And that, I realized, was all that mattered. The wedding day itself was everything we'd hoped it would be: simple, heartfelt, and filled with love. We chose an outdoor venue, a small garden tucked away behind an old inn, where the trees formed a natural canopy and the flowers were just beginning to bloom. The weather was perfect, the kind of crisp, sunny day that felt like a gift. I wore a dress that was more understated than I'd imagined I would. But it felt right the moment I put it on. Ben, in his dark suit and slightly crooked tie, looked at me like I was the only person in the world. As I walked down the aisle arm in arm with my father, I caught Ben's eye, and in that moment everything else fell away. There were no lingering doubts, no ghosts of the past, only the overwhelming certainty that this was where I was meant to be. When we exchanged our vows, I felt the truth of every word, the weight and joy of the promises we were making to each other. And when Ben slipped the ring onto my finger, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me, like all the pieces of my life had finally fallen into place. The reception that followed was a blur of laughter, music, and shared moments with the people we loved most. There were toasts, some touching, some hilariously embarrassing, and a first dance that was as awkward as it was sweet. Ben stepped on my toes twice, and we both ended up laughing so hard we nearly fell over. But it didn't matter. None of it did. What mattered was that we were there, together, surrounded by love and hope and the promise of a future that felt limitless. As the evening wound down and the last of our guests trickled away, Ben and I sat together on a bench beneath the stars, his jacket draped over my shoulders to ward off the chill. "So," he said, his hand warm against mine, "how does it feel to be married?" I smiled, resting my head against his shoulder. "It feels good, right? Like this is where I was always supposed to end up." He pressed a kiss to my temple, his voice soft. "Me too." In the years that followed, life continued to unfold in ways both expected and surprising. There were challenges, of course, moments of frustration and doubt, times when the weight of the world felt heavier than we could bear. But there was also so much joy. Lazy Sunday mornings spent in bed, the sunlight streaming through the curtains. Quiet evenings cooking dinner together, music playing softly in the background. Trips to new places, where we explored and laughed and made memories that became the foundation of our life together. And through it all, I held on to the lessons I had learned. That pain, while inevitable, doesn't have to define you. That endings, no matter how painful, are also beginnings. And that sometimes the life you thought you wanted isn't the life you were meant to have, but the one you find instead can be even better. Looking back, I realized that every step of the journey had brought me here, to this life, to this love. And for that I was grateful. Because in the end, it wasn't about the heartbreak or the mistakes or the moments of doubt. It was about the resilience, the hope, and the quiet, steady belief that better days were always ahead. And they were. They always would be. The years that followed were not without their complexities, but they were filled with a kind of warmth and stability I had never truly known. Marriage to Ben wasn't perfect. No relationship ever is. But it was real, grounded in mutual respect and an unwavering sense of partnership. We built our life slowly, brick by brick, finding joy in the mundane and comfort in the familiar. There were lazy mornings spent sipping coffee on the back porch, the smell of freshly cut grass mingling with the crisp air. There were long walks through the park, where we talked about everything and nothing, our words punctuated by the laughter of children playing nearby. There were quiet nights on the couch, my head resting on his shoulder as we watched some old movie neither of us was truly paying attention to. Ben and I worked well together, not because we were the same but because our differences complemented each other. He was patient where I was impulsive, grounded where I sometimes felt untethered. I brought him out of his comfort zone, and he taught me how to find calm in the chaos. We didn't always agree, but even in our disagreements there was a sense of safety, a knowledge that we could argue without fear of losing each other. It was a kind of security I had never truly known, and it became the foundation upon which we built everything else. One of the most transformative moments in our marriage came 2 years after the wedding. I remember the morning vividly. I had been feeling off for days, exhausted, nauseous, unable to focus. At first, I chalked it up to stress or maybe a lingering bug. But as the days wore on, a thought began to take root, tentative and fragile. I told myself not to get ahead of myself, not to hope too much. But when I finally worked up the courage to take a test, there it was. 2 pink lines, clear and unmistakable. I stared at the result for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. A mix of emotions washed over me. Joy, fear, disbelief, excitement. I wasn't sure how to tell Ben, whether to wait for the perfect moment or simply blurt it out. In the end, I couldn't wait. That evening, as we sat down to dinner, I slid the test across the table, unable to form the words. He stared at it, then at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. And then, slowly, realization dawned. His face broke into a smile so wide it took my breath away. And he laughed. A deep, genuine laugh that made my eyes well up with tears. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. I nodded, unable to speak. He stood, pulled me into his arms, and held me tightly, his hand resting gently on my stomach. "We're going to be parents," he whispered. And the words felt like a promise, like a new chapter beginning in a book we were writing together. Pregnancy was a journey in itself, filled with its own challenges and moments of wonder. Ben was there every step of the way, from late-night cravings to endless doctor's appointments. He read every book he could get his hands on, determined to be as prepared as possible, while I found myself navigating the whirlwind of emotions that came with creating a new life. There were days when I felt radiant, full of life and possibility, and others when I was so exhausted and uncomfortable that I could barely get out of bed. Through it all, Ben's support never wavered. He was my rock, my anchor, the steady hand I needed to guide me through the storm. The day our daughter was born was nothing short of transformative. I remember the moment they placed her in my arms, her tiny fingers curling around mine, her soft cries filling the room. She was perfect, this tiny fragile being who had already changed my world in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. Ben sat beside me, tears streaming down his face as he gazed at her with a mixture of awe and love. "She's beautiful," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She is," I agreed, my own tears falling freely. "She's ours." We named her Lily, after the flowers that had lined the path at our wedding. From the moment she entered our lives, she became the center of our world. Parenthood was a new kind of adventure, one that tested us in ways we hadn't anticipated, but also brought us closer together. There were sleepless nights and endless diaper changes, moments of frustration and self-doubt. But there were also first smiles and tiny giggles, the way her face lit up when she saw us, the joy of watching her take her first wobbly steps. As Lily grew, so did we. Our marriage evolved, shaped by the shared experiences of raising a child and navigating the complexities of life. There were times when we stumbled, when the demands of work and parenthood threatened to overwhelm us. But we always found our way back to each other, our bond strengthened by the challenges we faced together. Looking back, it's hard to believe how far I've come from the woman I was all those years ago. The heartbreak that once felt insurmountable now feels like a distant memory, a stepping stone on the path that led me here. I think about Jack sometimes, not with bitterness but with a quiet sense of closure. He was a part of my story, an important one, but he wasn't the ending. This life I've built with Ben and Lily is my true ending, or perhaps my true beginning. One evening as I tucked Lily into bed, she looked up at me with her wide, curious eyes. "Mommy," she said, her voice soft and sleepy, "are you happy?" The question caught me off guard, but my answer came without hesitation. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm very happy. And I meant it. My life isn't perfect, whose is? But it's full. Full of love and laughter, challenges and triumphs, quiet moments and big, beautiful ones. It's a life I never could have imagined back then, in the depths of my pain, but it's one I wouldn't trade for anything. Because in the end, it's not about the mistakes we make or the heartbreaks we endure. It's about what we do with them, how we grow, and where we go from there. For me, I chose to keep moving forward, to open myself up to love again, to build a life that felt whole and true. And in doing so, I found everything I didn't even know I was looking for. As I sat by the window that night, the house quiet after Lily had fallen asleep, I allowed myself a moment to reflect. The moonlight spilled across the floor, soft and silver, illuminating the little details of my life. Lily's drawings taped to the fridge, Ben's favorite book resting on the coffee table, the faint scent of lavender from the candle we'd lit earlier. These were the pieces of a life I had built from the ground up, each one a testament to the choices I'd made, the pain I'd endured, and the love I'd rediscovered. I thought about the version of me who had once cried herself to sleep, clutching the remnants of a broken marriage. I thought about the woman who had walked into therapy, uncertain of how to move forward, and the one who had cautiously let someone new into her heart. They were all me, each version carrying the weight of her own lessons, her own resilience. And yet, the woman I was now felt so different. Not lighter necessarily, but fuller, stronger. more whole. Because for all the heartache, all the missteps and doubts, I had found my way here. To a home filled with laughter and love. To a daughter who looked at me like I held the stars in my hands. To a man who had shown me what it meant to be truly seen, truly cherished. Ben came into the room then, his steps soft on the hardwood floor. He carried 2 mugs of tea, setting one down beside me before taking a seat. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned back and looked out at the night sky, his presence a quiet comfort. Finally he turned to me, his eyes warm and steady. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked. I smiled, taking a sip of the tea he'd made just the way I liked it. "Just thinking about how far we've come. How lucky I am." He reached for my hand, his fingers lacing with mine. "We're both lucky," he said. "And I think we've earned it." We sat there in companionable silence, the kind that only comes with knowing you're exactly where you're meant to be. The past no longer loomed large, and the future stretched out before us, open and full of possibility. I didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time I wasn't afraid. Because I knew no matter what I would be okay. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.